From ABC, this is World News Tonight with Peter Jennings. Sitting in tonight, Diane Sawyer.
Good evening. Between Washington and Baghdad today, plenty of messages, no sign of communication. From the day that Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait exactly 21 weeks ago, President Bush has insisted that only a complete withdrawal of Iraqi troops would be acceptable. And he said it again today, no compromise on anything. In Baghdad, no hint of compromise there either. The Iraqi ambassadors who flew home for consultations over the weekend began heading back to their posts. But ABC's Morton Dean reports their marching orders appear to be unchanged.
Iraq insists that the recall of its ambassadors from major foreign posts is a regular event and does not signal any change of policy. President Hussein is quoted as telling his ambassadors that he's ready for serious talks with the U.S., but that those talks must include the Palestinian issue. The U.S. is adamantly opposed to that. Late today, one of Hussein's principal aides, Information Minister Latif Jassim, also expressed a desire for a deep dialogue with the U.S., but with the usual conditions attached.
No one can force Iraq to fix a time to visit.
Are there any negotiations taking place now?
No, there is no discussion with any part.
No contacts?
No contact.
If discussions were held with the U.S., would Iraq be willing to make any concessions about Kuwait?
Kuwait is our province and Kuwait our land. Can you leave any province of your country?
Jassim said Iraq is prepared for a war.
Now we are ready to fight and protect our people, protect Iraq at any moment.
Asked whether he thought there would be war or peace, Jassim answered with a non-committal shrug. But from the way he was talking tonight, there was absolutely no hint of a breakthrough. Morton Dean, ABC News, Baghdad.
President Bush, who has been keeping a low profile at Camp David over the holidays, flew back to Washington today. His aides said it was to clear up some paperwork, but Mr. Bush made a point of stopping for reporters to deliver his public message to Baghdad. Here's ABC's Ann Compton.
Returning to Camp David after 6 hours back at the White House, President Bush was clearly frustrated. He said Saddam Hussein still does not believe the U.S. is serious about driving Iraq out of Kuwait.
I read the comments he makes about war, and I find it very difficult to believe he believes them. I still am hopeful that he'll get the message and he'll do what he ought to do, which is to get out of Kuwait by the 15th of January, totally without condition.
Where Iraq speaks of deep dialogue, President Bush insists that talks, if they ever happen, will not win Saddam any concessions.
There is not going to be a compromise with this man. That would be the worst signal to send to the people around the world that are together.
Adding to his frustration are news reports that his military commanders are telling him some combat units won't be ready to fight by January 15th. The president insisted he's satisfied the level of preparedness is just right.
There's been enough said about readiness, and I don't plan to continue to add to the debate at all. I'm very comfortable with what the briefing I had was quite different than most of the stories I'm reading in the last day or two.
Senior aides here admit that all the questions about readiness have raised a political risk. If Saddam Hussein believes the U.S. is not ready to fight, he will think he has time to stall. Ann Compton, ABC News, the White House.
All those questions about readiness have left a lot of people wondering what's taking so long. ABC's Chris Bury in Saudi Arabia has some answers.
More heavy tanks and artillery rolled off ships in a Saudi port today, part of the new Army forces just arriving from Germany. Marines are landing too, by the plane load. But more than 100,000 troops are still on the way, and they are not all expected to be in place until late January.
This deployment is just massive. I mean, you got to understand, the ships are coming, the personnel are coming, you got to marry them up.
It can take weeks for newly arriving troops to prepare their equipment and themselves for desert warfare. The Army has run out of desert uniforms. Soldiers arriving from Europe wear forest green instead.
We've got about 3 million of these uniforms that are on order. They're starting to come in to Saudi Arabia now towards the end of this month and first part of January. We'll be able to replace all of them.
Feeding up to 150,000 new soldiers is another of the logistical tangles that are expected to double the workload of U.S. support troops.
When I first heard that, it gave me a headache, and I said, if we're going to be feeding that amount of soldiers, it's going to require a lot of manpower to do it.
For every soldier up front, 3 now work in the rear. The troops that do the laundry, deliver mail, and bake the bread. But there are strains on the system. Spare parts, for example.
The biggest problem is getting parts in country and getting them to where they belong.
Every day, more than 3,000 trucks haul ammunition, fuel, and food to troops at the front. And the military is still expanding, building new roads and runways to improve supply lines for a possible offensive.
You know, it took 45 years to build up the force in Europe. We're doing it here in 5 months.
That is the fastest military deployment of its size in history. But it is not finished yet. And American commanders here may not be as ready as they would like to be by the January 15th deadline. Chris Bury, ABC News, Saudi Arabia.
In a moment, Mr. Gorbachev gets his vice president, but it isn't easy. And on the American agenda, a proposal to reclaim parts of the Great Plains for the American buffalo. And taking Chopin on the road.
This is World News Tonight with Peter Jennings. Brought to you by Honda.